I like the Soul Warrior. That's right, I said it. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think that they're like the best boss in the game, but I don't think that they deserve all the hate and the scorn that they've received. I've heard it 1,000 times. The Soul Warrior isn't even a real boss. Why is it in the Hall of the Gods? It's kind of just an ordinary enemy. Now, I'll be honest, I'm recording this video because of Scurry. Because I was recently watching one of their VODs, and they were talking about how there are like 5 Soul Warriors in the game, and that therefore they're just an ordinary enemy. Now, with all due respect, Scurry, I disagree. Let me break this down a little bit, okay? First off, there are not 5, but 4 Soul Warriors in the game, and 2 of those appear in the Trial of the Fool. Because they show up only in the Colosseum, I don't count them, and we're going to come back to that point. But at least for now, let's ignore those in the Colosseum, and just look at the 2 that are remaining. There's one that you encounter halfway through the Soul Sanctum on your way to fight Soul Master, and there's one that you fight later on to acquire Shade Soul. Now, both of these encounters are significant in your first journey through Hallownest. I just think that there's such a natural and organic progression in enemy difficulty throughout the Soul Sanctum that the distinction between a mini-boss and an enemy becomes really blurred. But that's really a good thing. That's praise for Team Cherry. That doesn't mean that Soul Warrior deserves to get trashed. Let me break down the progression of enemy difficulty. In the first room of the Soul Sanctum, we get locked in with the Soul Twister, which is, of course, a disappearing and teleporting enemy that throws balls of energy at us. We could consider this first room almost a mini boss, if you will. And if that sounds completely ridiculous, I have bad news for you. Because this is not the only place in Hollow Knight where we have an undeniable mini boss. I'm looking at Moss Knight, I'm looking at the Elder Balder, I'm looking at the Husk Guard, and there's probably even more examples that I can't think of right now. Anyways, mini bosses aside, by the time we get into the locked arena with Soul Warrior later on, we're very familiar with Soul Twisters already. And so a disappearing and teleporting enemy that throws balls of energy at us, well, we're already pretty familiar with fighting this kind of enemy. But that's not a weakness of Soul Warrior, that's a strength of the game design of Team Cherry. We should be praising them, not trashing my darling child. Because Soul Warrior has a very, very important secret. A secret that elevates this humble, fake boss to a very esteemed place. This power which, when it is revealed, it should make all gamers tremble. What is that secret? That secret is they are actually a Mantis Lord. Now, not literally, of course. Not in terms of lore, but rather in essence, in gameplay, as a boss and as a skill check. So bear with me, okay? Bear with me. We're gonna break this down. What attacks does a Mantis Lord do? They've got a downward dive, stabbing attack, a horizontal dash, stabbing attack, and a stationary projectile throwing attack. Circling back around, what attacks does the Soul Warrior have? Well, there's a downward dive stabbing attack, a horizontal dash stabbing attack, and a stationary projectile throwing attack. And this is no coincidence. Let's take a step back and remember our first playthrough of Hollow Knight. A significant amount of first-time players will have failed against the Mantis Lords before they encounter the Soul Warrior. And in just the same way as the Soul Twisters prepare you to fight Soul Warrior, so too do the Mantis Lords. Their similar attacks require the player to learn similar responses, essentially training the player to master using both jumps and dashes during combat. In other words, these bosses serve as a skill mastery checkpoint. You must be this good at using these skills, or
You shall not pass!
presumably, of course, because the boss serves as a gate, beyond which everything else requires that you are already comfortable using certain skills. Because what, after all, is a boss but a skill checkpoint? A boss is a wall set up to confine the player until the player has the skills necessary to overcome it. You could almost classify the bosses in Hollow Knight in terms of their player skill checks. Soul Warrior could be fighting with Dash 101. Mantis Lords would be fighting with Dash 201. Gruzmother and Vengefly King would be like fundamentals of aerial combat. Now that we've mentioned Gruzmother and Vengefly King, I'm reminded of the Colosseum Trials. Ooh, you thought I forgot about that, didn't you?
You fool. I took your attention.
The Colosseum Trials have a lot in common with the Pantheons in Godhome, and I'm strongly inclined to think of them comparably in terms of their bearing on lore. Like, just because there's a statue in Godhome that lets you fight the Absolute Radiance does not mean that the Absolute Radiance herself really ever existed. Godhome shows us the bosses of Hallownest at their theoretical apex. Because Godhome isn't a space that's really about world building and lore for the most part. It's a somewhat arbitrary space that's been set up so that players can have extra things to do for fun. Just like the Colosseum, it's a very gamey space, unlike the rest of Hallownest. And just like in Godhome, many bosses reappear in the Colosseum Trials. The Vengefly King and the two Gruzmothers, for example, in the Trial of the Warrior. And then there's also Brooding Molech and Soul Warrior in the Trial of the Fool. Now, unless we want to say that none of these are bosses, I think we ought to just leave Soul Warrior the frick alone and give them a little bit of respect. And yes, I'll admit it. Vengefly King and Gruzmother are barely bosses. But that's because they're early game bosses. The distinction between an early game boss and an ordinary enemy disappearing over time is not the sign of a weak or an inferior boss, but rather it is a sign of superior game design and excellent balancing of difficulty. If I will be allowed to consider only those Soul Warriors that occur in the base game, outside of anything in Godhome or the Colosseum Trials, we are left with just two. The one that serves as an early game skill check on whether the player has mastered fighting with dash, just like the Mantis Lords, And the second one, an upgraded version with increased health, which spawns follies and guards the extremely powerful Shade Soul upgrade. The large ornate door is likely one of the first things the player will encounter in the Soul Sanctum. It's placed right next to the entrance, and its unique design really makes an impression. Without a word, the player knows that this is an important spot to come back to, and they should make sure to remember it. This boss encounter was so significant that they had to lock it behind a huge, ornate door, the key to which was itself locked behind another key, which at the beginning of the game is just lost. From a game design perspective, everything about this says two things. One, this is an optional thing, and you can easily miss it. And two, if you get through this door, there will be something very special waiting for you. Soul Warrior's placement as a final obstacle to the player remains significant, if for no other reason than that it follows the pattern of most bosses in Hollow Knight occurring twice, once in a basic form and again in an upgraded form. The first version is more or less mandatory, and the second is more or less optional, but guarding a valuable reward or upgrade. That pattern basically follows with the Crystal Guardian, with Hornet, with the False Knight, with Broken Vessel, with Soul Master, and I can just keep going. So, by all means, feel free to flame me in the comments. Bring it on. Flame me for having the audacity to defend my beloved, the humble Soul Warrior. I just had to get this out of my system, okay? Now maybe it's just the devil's advocate in me, or maybe I'm just a hopeless contrarian. I don't know. I just hope that this video gave you something new to think about, even if you don't entirely agree with me. So as we're closing this out, let me say this to you, Scurry. If you come after my child again, there will be consequences. I'll be sad. Those will be the consequences.